No, I'm not talking about gravity. That's why the water falls over Niagara Falls. I'm talking about why did Niagara Falls exist. And on today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, we're going to explore a little bit about a thing called karst and the relationship of karstic landscapes to the Niagara Falls situation, and ultimately why Niagara Falls fall. And we'll ask the cards for their layered advice about our work and life. On today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet, I'm John Paulus. Thanks for joining me. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. If you've already subscribed, thank you so much. And if you'd like to support Life's Potluck Buffet in a different way, and you use a Brave browser, as I do, you can now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube through your Brave browser. Thank you for your support, and thank you, as always, for listening. Let's start with karst, because karst is fun to say. What is karst? So karst is the word for a particular type of land formation that is made up of rocks that can dissolve. I think that's the simplest explanation. And all of these rocks that it's made up of are called carbonate rocks because they have carbonate in them. And the most important one is limestone, which is calcium carbonate. Other things that are calcium carbonate that you're familiar with are things like eggshells and chalk. Oh, also the shells of shellfish, like a clam shell or an oyster shell. They are made up. They have a lot of calcium carbonate in them. It's the shell part that makes it a shell. And a lot of limestone topographies, these kind of landscapes that we're talking about, are made up of old seabeds that are now no longer sea floors, but are rather very far inland or even mountains. And so that is interesting, but not every karst landscape is made up of that kind of remnants of organic life. Some of it's not biological life, so because the calcium carbonate exists by itself as well. So that is the basic of the karst idea. Now, there are a lot of karst landscapes all around the earth. Places where they're rarer are, if you live in South India, there's not a lot of karst there. If you're in the Amazon in South America, there's not a lot of karst there. In fact, South America, it doesn't have a lot of karstic landscapes, although there are some. The United States, if you're in the United States, there are a lot of karst landscapes, and some of them quite large bodies of karstic landscapes. So, for example, the Midwest, say in Indiana, that area, places where you're probably familiar with the amount of limestone going on in these places. In fact, Indiana limestone is kind of famous for building materials in the United States. For example, the outside of the Empire State Building in New York City is Indiana limestone. So that if you don't know what limestone looks like, then there's a good example. If you take a look and see, that's what it looks like when it's nicely cut and finished and so forth. So a good telltale sign of a karst landscape is when there are sinkholes or caves. So because the whole point of it being made out of things like limestone, etc. And there's another important stone that it's made out of that I'll talk about in a second, which is going to be important to Niagara Falls. But because these are soluble, remember we were talking about dissolving and so forth. These these are water soluble. So what happens is if you have water that flows over it, it forms a sinkhole. And so places with a lot of sinkholes are usually karst landscapes. So anytime you read in the news, there's this sinkhole all of a sudden in some place, there's a good chance that there's a karstic landscape there, although there are many other reasons for sinkholes in populated areas. But in areas that are not highly populated, the karst landscape is a really good reason for sinkholes to happen. And same thing with caves, because the water goes through, and underground water creates big caves that will then be explorable, etc. Another famous karstic landscape is, and I'm using the adjective there, karstic. It's just karst. It's just the adjective for something as karst. The is the those cone shaped in South China. South China has large amounts of karst landscape. And those cone shaped rock outcroppings in China. Sometimes they're covered in forests. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're very famous for the people who like climbing and free climbing and things like that. All of those tend to be karst landscapes because, again, the water is able to erode, and it erodes unevenly. And this is going to be of interest to our Niagara Falls thing. Actually, this is the solution to our Niagara Falls puzzle, which I'll get to in a moment. But another place where the actual word karst comes from is from the areas around what is now Slovenia and Croatia, where we have words like krš and kars, and this is where the German-speaking people who named karst got the words to describe karst. And the areas that are now, as I said, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, that's a big karstic landscape there. A lot of karst there. And in fact, I think the largest, what is called a polje, which just means field in the Slavic languages of that area, the southern Slavic languages. The largest polje, which is what we use in English to describe a karst plain, is in Bosnia, and it's enormous. And it's covered in, grass and soil and so forth. It's not, the idea behind this is that it doesn't need to be just raw rock to be called karst. It's quite the opposite. In fact, the most of these karstic landscapes are covered with soil, and there's plants on top of the soil. So there's a lot of that going on. There aren't a lot of things like lakes in karstic landscapes. Usually there aren't. And the reason for that is because the water goes through the soil down into the limestone, and it can create sinkholes or it can go into aquifers, but it doesn't really tend to form lakes. That's a real property of these karst landscapes. So you don't tend to see lakes because the water can't really sit on top of it. It goes through it because it's water soluble, and the water, creates channels that dissolve into it. And that could be a sinkhole, that could be a cave, or it could just simply go through like a filter, and then you have an aquifer where the water would collect between layers of the stone. So that gives you a good sense of what we're talking about here. Another type of stone that is common in these karst landscapes is another carbonate stone called dolomite. And dolomite was actually discovered in the Tyrol, in what is now northern Italy. And it was discovered by a person from Dolomieu in France, whose end of his name was de Dolomieu, meaning of Dolomieu. And that is the person who they named Dolomite after. And you might be familiar with the Dolomite Alps in mostly in northern Italy now, where the 2026 Winter Olympics will happen at Cortina d'Ampezzo, which is in the Dolomite Alps. And that those Dolomite Alps are made largely of dolomite and were renamed after the rock that was discovered by Dolomieu to be different from limestone, because he tested it to see if it was limestone, but it didn't. One of the tests for limestone that involves the application of an acid to it, it didn't do the same thing. It didn't fizz the way limestone fizzes. And so that meant this was a different stone, which means that there was something going on there, and that's how Dolomieu discovered dolomite. And the outcropping of dolomite and limestone is going to be the reason why we have Niagara Falls. And here's how it works. So there's a outcropping of the carbonate rocks, and this has a good deal of dolomite in it. And that outcropping, it starts up somewhere around Wisconsin and kind of goes around where the Great Lakes are, and it's kind of like an arc of this carbonate rock, and that goes through the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then down around Ontario, and these are around the edges of the Great Lakes there, Michigan and Huron, and then it goes through Ontario and then makes a little bit of a turn and goes right through that north-south border of Canada and the United States at the Ontario and New York border. And there's another thing that goes north-south through that, and that's the Niagara River, which is actually flowing from the south to the north because it's coming from Lake Erie and going up to Lake Ontario and then out the St. Lawrence Seaway into the Atlantic Ocean. So when you're looking at, say, the Horseshoe Falls, which are the biggest ones that basically straddle the border of Canada and the United States, you're looking south because the river is flowing north. There's another one of the other falls that's wholly on the New York side of the U.S.-Canada border. It is actually falling west because the river kind of makes a few turns and splits and does a thing over there. So that's why that's what goes on there. And all of the falls are falling over that line of carbonate rocks that I've been talking about that starts in Wisconsin and arcs all the way above and down and then across the U.S.-Canada border between Ontario and New York. And that you can see along various in various places along where this is there's a ridge. It's called an escarpment, or in Spanish, a cuesta. And that is a kind of, I think the best way to describe it is like a sloped hill, cliff, ridge thing. That's what that is. And what's going on here is, and this is why Niagara Falls is because there's a cap, and the cap on this ridge is the carbonate rocks that we were talking about, and underneath that and next to it in certain places is a shale bedrock, and shale is made of basically clay. And so when water runs over it, the carbonate stones don't wear down very quickly in comparison to the clay shale, which is very easily eroded. And when the Niagara River runs over the escarpment, that is what is called the Niagara Escarpment, which is this line of these carbonate rocks that that form that. And this is really a karst landscape. It runs into the shale layer underneath this. And so the shale layer goes away faster than the layer of the carbonate rocks. And so what you have there is the carbonate rocks stay high, and then the water hitting the shale erodes it away. And eventually you have in the place where Niagara Falls is, there's a great amount of shale that could get worn away there. And that is what it causes the difference between where the waterfalls fall into in the river and where they start. And that's because those carbonate rocks of the karst topography are not eroding as quickly as the shale, so they stay up, and then the shale goes away. And so you have this big drop, and that's why, because there's a cap of the carbonate rocks, and below it there is the shale layers that are getting eroded over millennia, so that you now have a big distance between the carbonate rock escarpment and that's on top, and the shale layer that is on the bottom, and you have a very large drop for the Niagara River to fall, and therefore you have very large waterfalls, hence Niagara Falls. So let's see what the cards have to say about all of these layers of sedimentary rocks and what that has to do with our life and work. So cards, you ready? Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us something. Here we go. It's card 8. Others always need something from you. Get clarity on what you do for others and what others need from you. Then align that need with what you need for yourself. So today, think of what something you do is that others always ask you for. And then think, how can I align that with what I need for myself? So give that a thought, and I will see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.